Ethan Carter was just 12 years old on that chilly autumn morning when he set foot into the bustling terminal of a major U.S. airport. With his heart fluttering like a hummingbird's wings, he clutched a crinkled boarding pass that he treated as his most prized possession, a symbol of independence and adventure. His small backpack, snug on his shoulders, carried everything he needed for the journey: a packet of his favorite American-style snacks, a well-worn sketch pad with blank pages waiting for his creative thoughts, a pair of over-ear headphones that had accompanied him on many quiet afternoons, and a neatly folded letter from his mom. The letter, written in a warm, encouraging hand, had simply said, "Sit by the window and look at the mountains. You'll feel like you're flying over a painting." Those words, repeated in his mind, had given him comfort and a sense of connection to home, even as he ventured into the unknown. Ethan had been meticulous in following every instruction. He arrived early, checked in at the counter with a polite smile, and waited his turn in the seemingly endless line of passengers. Despite the steady hum of conversation, rolling suitcases, and the occasional beeping of electronic devices, a quiet confidence filled him. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, his small hands trembled slightly, and he felt the pressure of the responsibility resting on his young shoulder. Today was not just any day. It was the day he would fly alone for the very first time, bound for Seattle, where a 2-week robotics camp awaited him. His dad had worked hard to sponsor his trip, and the pride in his mother's eyes that morning was something Ethan carried with him like a treasured secret. However, as he approached the boarding gate, the atmosphere began to change. The friendly hum of airport activity seemed to give way to an undercurrent of tension that he could not quite place. Standing at the gate was Colleen Drezna, a flight attendant whose presence commanded attention in a way that left Ethan feeling unusually small. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer and sporting a bold red lipstick that contrasted starkly with her otherwise stern expression, Colleen exuded an air of self-importance. Her name tag, clear and unyielding, simply read, "Colleen Drezna." Without a hint of warmth, she glanced at Ethan, not at his face, but as if he were an inconvenient interruption, and asked in a clipped tone, "Are you lost?" Ethan's voice, though wavering with nerves, managed to remain steady as he replied, "I'm boarding flight 262 to Seattle." His words were carefully chosen, the result of countless reminders from his parents to be both polite and assertive. He produced his printed confirmation with a slight flourish, hoping it would quell any doubts. But Colleen's eyes narrowed, and instead of reaching for the scanner as all others had, she hesitated. With a slight tilt of her head that suggested disbelief rather than inquiry, she demanded, "Where are your parents?" The question stung like a sudden gust of bitter wind. Ethan explained in a quiet, measured tone that he was flying alone. His father had already boarded the plane. He showed her the confirmation once again, holding it out like a fragile shield against her suspicion. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in Colleen's eyes. A brief pause where it seemed the truth might have been acknowledged, but she quickly buried that spark beneath layers of indifference and arrogance. "We don't just let kids wander up here on their own," she said coldly, her arms folding over her chest as if to reinforce her authority. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. He repeated his explanation, his voice trembling as he insisted, "I'm not wandering. I'm flying alone. My dad is on the plane." But before he could utter another word, Colleen reached out with deliberate, measured movements. In a single, swift gesture that seemed calculated rather than accidental, she took his boarding pass between two cold fingers, scrutinized it for barely 3 seconds, and then tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed in the quiet corner of the gate, like the snapping of fragile dreams. For a long, agonizing moment, Ethan stood frozen. His mouth opened in shock, and then nothing. No words, no protests, just a stunned silence that seemed to draw the attention of every person around him. The torn fragments of paper fluttered in the air, each piece a painful reminder of a moment he could never undo. "Now you'll wait here until we figure out who you really are," Colleen declared flatly. her tone final and unyielding. The room around him seemed to blur and tilt as confusion set in, while the murmurs of the passengers behind him grew into a quiet, collective dismay. Ethan tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't do anything wrong." But his protest was cut short by the sharp retort. "You're being disruptive now," Colleen snapped, the word disruptive reverberating in his ears like a condemnatory verdict. He looked desperately around, seeking help from a nearby gate agent, from fellow passengers, even from the security officer who stood uncomfortably against a wall, yet it felt as though he had suddenly become invisible. A problem too small, or perhaps too inconvenient, for anyone else to address. As the silence stretched on, a younger flight attendant named Ryan, identifiable by the small headset resting on his ear and a name tag that simply read Ryan, shifted uneasily on his feet. His eyes betrayed a silent plea for someone to do something, yet his lips remained sealed. His body language, a constant shifting from one foot to the other, spoke volumes of his inner conflict. He wanted to help, but was uncertain how to break through the icy barrier that Colleen had erected. Meanwhile, Colleen's eyes remained fixed on Ethan with a blend of disdain and self-assurance, as if her actions were not only justified but necessary to maintain order. Ethan's inner world was a tempest of emotions. Each beat of his heart reminded him of the injustice he was facing. A young boy, following all the rules, only to be humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. The remnants of his boarding pass, now a symbol of betrayal, slipped slowly through his fingers. In his jacket pocket, he clutched the letter from his mom as if it were a talisman against the cruelty of the moment. The paper, soft and fragile, held the promise of solace and a gentle reminder of unconditional love, yet even that comfort felt distant now. The terminal, with its constant flow of activity, seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding at gate C12. Around him, the soundscape was filled with the hum of rolling suitcases, distant beeps from security scanners, and snippets of conversation that barely registered as support. A businessman 2 rows away tapped away at his laptop, his fingers moving with brisk efficiency, seemingly unaware of the suffering unfolding just a few feet away. A baby cried softly near the charging station, and even the automated announcements over the loudspeakers seemed routine, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within Ethan. As the minutes stretched painfully, Ethan's initial shock began to give way to a deep, numbing sadness. He felt as though he had been cast aside, reduced to a mere inconvenience in a system that valued rules over the well-being of a frightened child. His eyes, stinging with the threat of tears, searched the crowd for any sign of empathy or intervention. Every glance from a nearby traveler, every subtle nod of sympathy, only deepened his sense of isolation. In that moment, he realized how small and powerless he truly was, a tiny figure battling a system that seemed indifferent to his plight. Then, as if the universe had finally decided to tilt the scales, a stocky TSA officer in his 50s approached the scene. Chewing gum and sporting mirrored sunglasses indoors, the officer exuded an air of detached professionalism. His presence, however, was a welcome interruption to the cold cruelty that had dominated the past few minutes. "You got a guardian here?" he barked, his tone a mixture of irritation and concern as he looked between Ethan and Colleen. Ethan's response came in a quiet murmur, "My dad is on the plane already." His voice was small and uncertain, yet it carried the weight of a truth that could not be denied. The officer quickly tapped on his tablet, his eyes narrowing as he cross-referenced the manifest. In a few tense moments, he announced that the system had recorded 2 Delanceys on the flight, Benson Delancey, who had checked in just half an hour earlier, and Ethan himself, who was properly flagged as an unaccompanied minor. The officer's words, matter-of-fact and clear, were like a ray of light piercing through the dark cloud of humiliation that had enveloped Ethan. For a brief moment, it appeared that justice might be restored. Yet even as the TSA officer confirmed Ethan's legitimacy, Colleen's expression remained one of unyielding stubbornness. Her arms remained crossed, her eyes still hard and unrepentant, as though the facts before her were an insult to her authority rather than a corrective measure. The young attendant Ryan, whose earlier discomfort had been evident, finally mustered the courage to speak up in a low, steady voice. "I verified his unaccompanied minor status myself. Everything checks out," he said, his tone laced with the quiet certainty of someone who believed in doing what was right despite the cost of challenging a superior. At that moment, a murmur of discontent began to ripple through the waiting passengers. A woman in her late 30s, seated a few rows away, softly remarked, "He didn't do anything wrong." Another traveler echoed her sentiment, "This just doesn't feel right." The solidarity among the onlookers, though subdued, offered a faint glimmer of hope to Ethan. For the first time since the ordeal began, he sensed that he was not entirely alone, that there were those who recognized the cruelty of the moment and silently wished for his vindication. Then, amid the tense silence and growing murmurs, a calm and authoritative voice emerged from behind the security barrier. It was a voice that cut through the discord without raising its volume, yet carried an unmistakable tone of quiet power and resolve. "Is there a reason my son isn't on that plane?" the voice asked. Heads turned, and the air seemed to shift as Benson Delancey stepped forward. Unlike the stern, harsh demeanors that had dominated the scene, Benson's presence was gentle yet firm. Dressed in a plain, slate-gray jacket open over a crisp white button-down shirt, he exuded a quiet dignity that immediately commanded respect. His stride was measured and confident, and though he was not physically imposing, his eyes conveyed a depth of understanding and a determination that silenced any lingering doubts. Ryan's eyes widened as he took in the sight of Benson, and in that moment, it was clear that the balance of power was beginning to shift. Benson's calm inquiry, rooted in both paternal concern and a quiet insistence on fairness, was a stark contrast to Colleen's callous demeanor. "Did you even scan his name?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with an undercurrent of disappointment. The question hung in the air as Ethan, still trembling from the earlier humiliation, managed to whisper, "Dad, are you okay?" His voice was barely audible, but it carried the raw emotion of a child who had been pushed to the brink of despair. Benson's eyes softened as he knelt to meet Ethan's gaze, offering a few reassuring words that, though simple, radiated warmth and protection. Then, turning back to Colleen, he calmly questioned, "Why was his ticket destroyed? Did you check the unaccompanied minor list?" His words, though measured, carried the weight of authority and a plea for accountability. Colleen's face flushed a deep shade of crimson, a fleeting admission of uncertainty before she quickly masked it with further indignation. "I didn't think I needed to," she retorted, her voice stiff and defensive. "I assumed everything was in order." At that moment, Ryan reiterated his earlier confirmation with quiet firmness. "I checked it myself. He is cleared for unaccompanied minor service. The system flagged no issues." His words, delivered with the straightforward honesty of someone who cared deeply about doing the right thing, resonated with the small crowd that had gathered. It was a stark reminder that rules and procedures were in place not to cause harm, but to protect those who needed it most. In the midst of this tense standoff, the atmosphere was charged with conflicting emotions. On one side was Colleen, whose actions had not only disrupted a young boy's travel plans, but had also revealed an unsettling streak of cruelty. Her demeanor, once the epitome of bureaucratic authority, now appeared almost malicious, a calculated display of power that left Ethan feeling shattered and exposed. On the other side stood Benson, whose quiet insistence on fairness and compassion provided a counterbalance to the harshness of the situation. His calm, measured words and protective stance stirred a sense of hope in Ethan's heart, even as the scars of humiliation burned fresh. Ethan felt a torrent of emotions swirling inside him: fear, sadness, anger, and a profound sense of injustice. The torn fragments of his boarding pass, now held loosely in his small hands, were a physical reminder of the cruelty he had endured. Every detail of the encounter, the dismissive tone, the sneering glance, the harsh word disruptive, etched itself into his memory like a painful lesson about a world that sometimes valued procedure over compassion. Yet, amid that pain, there was a spark of resilience, a quiet determination to endure, even when it seemed that everyone had turned a blind eye. As the scene unfolded, the murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder, carrying with them an unspoken message of solidarity. Strangers exchanged glances filled with sympathy, and a few even whispered reassurances that things would be made right. Though Ethan felt isolated and small in that vast terminal, those fleeting moments of compassion, however subtle, offered him a lifeline, a reminder that he was not entirely invisible. Benson, ever the steady presence, continued his measured dialogue with Colleen. "I stayed behind to observe today's boarding process because there have been complaints about staffing on this route," he explained, his tone both matter-of-fact and laced with quiet reproach. "I needed to see for myself how my son was being treated." His words, simple yet profound, cut through the lingering tension. It was not a demand for revenge, but rather a call for accountability, a plea for the system to recognize that behind every procedure lay a human being with feelings and a right to be treated with dignity. Colleen's eyes darted briefly between Benson and Ryan before she attempted to reassert her authority. "Well, I have been doing this job for over 20 years, she insisted, her voice rising slightly in a futile effort to drown out the mounting discontent. "I know when something smells off, and I know what to do." But her words, once intended to convey expertise, now came off as bitter and defensive. To Ethan's ears, they sounded less like a reassurance and more like a cold justification for his humiliation. The conversation grew more charged as Benson pressed further. "If you had followed the proper procedures, if you had scanned his name as required, this whole situation could have been avoided," he said softly, his tone laden with disappointment. "My son should never have had to feel so alone and so small." Each word was a gentle rebuke, an appeal to common decency that seemed to echo around the terminal. In that moment, the disparity between the rigid world of airline protocols and the warmth of human empathy became painfully clear. As the minutes ticked by, the incident began to transform from a simple administrative error into a broader commentary on the cruelty that can sometimes hide behind the veneer of authority. For Ethan, what began as a routine trip to a robotics camp had turned into a lesson in the harsh realities of the world. A lesson that left him with a deep, lingering sadness. The memory of that day, marked by the cold cruelty of Colleen's actions and the fleeting kindness of strangers, would stay with him long after the torn pieces of his boarding pass were forgotten. The terminal, with its echoing announcements and ceaseless flow of passengers, continued on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet, for those who had witnessed the exchange, a quiet understanding had been forged. They recognized that sometimes the rules and procedures that govern our daily lives can, in their rigidity, become instruments of pain when applied without compassion. And while no grand gesture of redemption was offered in that moment, there was a small, unspoken promise in the air that one day, perhaps, the balance would tip in favor of those who were vulnerable and in need of kindness. Ethan's eyes, red-rimmed and shimmering with unshed tears, told a story of inner strength amid despair. Though he had been reduced to a mere inconvenience by one person's callous actions, the silent support of his father, the gentle intervention of Ryan, and the sympathetic glances from the crowd reminded him that he was more than just a ticket or a number on a manifest. He was a child with dreams, a heart full of hope, and a spirit that could not be easily broken. In the aftermath of the confrontation, as Benson's calm authority began to restore order, Ethan slowly began to feel a sense of protection. His father's quiet yet firm stance not only validated his experience, but also gently chided the system that had allowed such cruelty to manifest. Every detail, from the way Colleen had flung aside the torn remains of his boarding pass to the indifferent murmurs of bystanders, served as a reminder of how easily a child could be crushed under the weight of bureaucratic indifference. And yet, in that same moment, The compassion of those who stood up for him lit a small beacon of hope in the darkness. Benson continued to speak, his voice gentle yet resolute. "I would like this entire exchange reviewed on the security feed," he stated plainly. "From the moment my son was singled out to the exact moment his boarding pass was destroyed." His request was not an act of vengeance, but a clear demand for accountability, a call for a review of procedures that, if followed correctly, would ensure no other child would have to endure such humiliation. Ryan promptly acknowledged the request, tapping his headset as he relayed the order to the supervisor. Though the formal process had just begun, the damage had been done. The memory of this encounter would forever be etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. As Ethan stood there, still clutching the remnants of his ticket and the precious letter from his mom, he felt a mix of emotions that was impossible to capture in simple words. There was deep sorrow, a profound sense of injustice, and a growing realization that the world was not always as kind as he had once believed. And yet, amid that storm of despair, a small part of him also felt the stirring of resolve, a quiet determination to rise above the cruelty and to hold on to the belief that kindness, though sometimes hidden, could still be found. The events of that day at the gate resonated far beyond the immediate moment of confrontation. In the days and weeks that followed, Ethan's experience became a turning point, a story he would one day share with others, as a reminder of the importance of empathy and the devastating impact of unchecked authority. For the onlookers, the incident served as a call to look deeper into the everyday interactions that define our lives, to question procedures when they conflict with basic human decency, and to stand up, even in the smallest ways, for those who cannot speak for themselves. In the soft glow of the departing afternoon sun filtering through the terminal windows, as passengers continued on to their destinations, the echoes of that day lingered. The torn pieces of paper, now long forgotten by most, had become a symbol of the fragile intersection between duty and compassion. And while the cold, unyielding actions of one flight attendant had momentarily cast a shadow over an otherwise ordinary day, the courage of a small boy and the protective presence of a loving father had illuminated a path forward. A path where every individual, regardless of age or status, deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with respect. As Ethan finally boarded the plane, his small figure settling into a seat by the window, he looked out at the vast expanse of sky and distant mountains with a heart that was heavy, yet hopeful. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with both promise and lingering memories of pain. But as the plane taxied down the runway and began its ascent into the clouds, Ethan allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. He thought about the kindness he had received, the injustice he had endured, and the knowledge that even in a world that often seemed indifferent, there were still people who cared enough to stand up for what was right. In that moment, as the American landscape unfolded beneath him and the gentle hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, Ethan's thoughts turned to the future. He imagined a world where no child would ever feel as alone or as powerless as he had felt that day. He pictured a future where authority figures remembered that their decisions affected real lives, lives filled with dreams, hopes, and the simple need to be treated with dignity. And though the memory of Colleen's harsh words and the cruel destruction of his boarding pass would forever be a part of him, it would also serve as a reminder that even in the face of injustice, the human spirit could find strength, and that kindness, however small, could be the light that guided one through the darkest moments. For Ethan, that flight was more than just a means of travel. It was a journey into the complexities of a world that was as capable of beauty as it was of cruelty. It was a day that taught him that while rules and procedures were important, they should never come at the expense of compassion and empathy. And as the plane soared higher into the sky, carrying him closer to his destination and further from the painful encounter at the gate, Ethan silently vowed to remember every detail. He would remember the cold dismissal, the hostile glare, and the overwhelming feeling of being misunderstood. But he would also remember the steady, reassuring presence of his father, the quiet support of a brave attendant who dared to speak up, and the subtle nods of solidarity from strangers. These memories, interwoven with both sorrow and hope, would guide him as he grew older and learned that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in avoiding hardship, but in rising above it. In the gentle cadence of the airplane's engines and the soft murmur of conversation around him, Ethan found solace in the knowledge that his story was not over. The events of that day had etched themselves into his heart, teaching him lessons about authority, compassion, and resilience that no classroom could ever impart. And though he had experienced more pain than any 12-year-old should ever have to endure, he also discovered that within him lay the quiet power to persevere. With each mile the plane traveled over the vast American landscape, he carried with him the promise of a better tomorrow, a tomorrow where empathy would triumph over indifference, where every child's voice would be heard, and where even the smallest among us would be treated with the dignity they so richly deserved. In retrospect, that fateful day at Gate C-12 became a turning point for Ethan Carter, a moment when the harsh realities of the world collided with the innocence of youth, leaving behind scars that were as real as they were transformative. As he grew older, he would come to understand that the cruelty of one person did not define the world, but rather highlighted the pressing need for kindness and understanding in every corner of our society. And though the memory of Colleen Drezna's unyielding cruelty would forever remain a dark chapter in his early life, it also served as a catalyst for change, a reminder that every injustice, no matter how small, deserved to be challenged. Today, as Ethan reflects on that long-ago experience, he does so not with bitterness, but with a deep, empathetic understanding of the complexities of human nature. He knows that sometimes those in positions of power can lose sight of the very humanity they are meant to protect. Yet he also believes that within every challenge lies an opportunity for growth, a chance for society to learn, adapt, and become more compassionate. His journey that day was not just about boarding a plane. It was about witnessing firsthand the delicate interplay between duty and decency, authority and empathy, and in that interplay, he discovered a truth that would guide him for the rest of his life: that every individual, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, has the right to be treated with respect, understanding, and kindness. As the aircraft continued its steady climb into the vast blue sky carrying Ethan toward his destination, the memory of that challenging morning mingled with the promise of a new adventure. In that blend of past pain and future hope, he found the strength to look ahead, ready to embrace the opportunities and challenges that lay in wait. For in every hardship endured, there was a lesson learned, and in every tear shed, there was the potential for growth. And as the plane soared gracefully above the patchwork of American cities and countryside, Ethan Carter, though still a child in many ways, carried within him a profound understanding of what it meant to be resilient, compassionate, and determined to forge a better path not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or misunderstood. This is the story of a young boy who, against all odds, stood tall in the face of unwarranted cruelty and emerged with a quiet strength that would guide him through life. It is a story of conflict and confrontation, of injustice met with a call for fairness, and of the enduring hope that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can find a way to shine. And as Ethan's journey continues, the lessons of that day remain etched in his heart, a testament to the transformative power of empathy, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the belief that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can change the course of a life. In the end, while the echoes of that fateful morning still resounded in the halls of the airport and in the memories of those who witnessed it, the true victory lay not in a perfect resolution of rules and protocols, but in the quiet triumph of the human heart. A heart that, even when battered by cruelty, continues to beat with hope, determination, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be seen, heard, and loved. And so, as the airplane continued its smooth journey into the bright American sky, Ethan Carter, though scarred by the events of that day, moved forward with the gentle assurance that his story, like the countless others who have faced injustice, was a powerful reminder that compassion and empathy can, in the end, prevail over indifference and cruelty. Evelyn Carter was only 12 when she first encountered the cruelty that would change her view of the world that day. As the commotion at the gate grew more intense, a kind-faced woman sitting nearby rose from her seat and walked over. "I saw the whole thing," she said gently, her voice warm yet laced with concern. "Your son was very polite. He said he was flying alone and showed his pass, but she didn't even bother to read it." Evelyn's father, Benson Delancey, gave a slight nod of gratitude toward the woman, and for a brief moment, Colleen, whose cold, rigid manner had set the tone for the entire ordeal, let her arms fall to her sides as if to acknowledge the truth. Yet even then, Colleen's posture, though appearing a bit smaller, still attempted to project an air of authority as she muttered something about not knowing who he was. "That is exactly the problem," Benson replied firmly. "It should not matter who he is." A heavy silence fell over the gate, a silence so profound it did not need any words to fill it. Moments later, a supervisor strode briskly toward them. His badge caught the overhead lights, and with an apologetic tone he said, "Mr. Delancey, apologies for the delay. We were just informed of the issue." Without missing a beat, Benson interjected, "We need a full report filed, and I want absolute assurance that my son boards without any further interference." The supervisor's expression remained calm as he responded, "Yes, of course. He is cleared to board, and we will issue a new ticket immediately." Evelyn's eyes, still red and full of unshed tears from the earlier humiliation, remained fixed on the scraps of paper that had once been her boarding pass. Her small hands trembled as her father gently touched her shoulder and softly asked, "Are you good to fly?" She managed a quiet nod, whispering, "I just didn't get why she looked at me like that." Benson paused, his gaze shifting from his precious daughter to Colleen, who stubbornly continued to see only what she wanted to see, ignoring the undeniable truth of the situation. The supervisor cleared his throat and then addressed Benson directly. "Mr. Delancey, would you like us to handle this internally, or would you prefer I file my own report? I'm not here for any drama. I'm here for accountability." His words, sharp yet measured, hung in the air for a moment as if marking the turning point of the day. Even as procedures resumed and apologies were muttered, it was clear that something deeper had taken root. This incident was not going to end with a mere reprint of a boarding pass. Evelyn, still quietly reeling from the earlier events, moved away from the crowd and stood near the window, gazing out at the bustling tarmac below. The gate agent busily scrambled to reprint her boarding pass, a small act that felt like a feeble attempt to restore some order to a day that had been anything but ordinary. Meanwhile, Benson remained at the center of the unfolding drama, surrounded by a group of busy onlookers who had suddenly remembered how to look important. Colleen, refusing to face the reality of her actions, had retreated behind the gate desk. She pretended to double-check seating charts that, in truth, did not require any extra scrutiny. It was painfully obvious to everyone that she knew eyes were on her, and that her authority was being questioned. With deliberate calm, Benson walked over to her. His tone was not one of anger, but of clear disappointment. "You didn't just tear up a boarding pass," he said steadily. "You tore up a moment my daughter had been looking forward to for weeks." For a brief instant, Colleen's hand froze on the keyboard. She did not meet his eyes. Instead, she mumbled, "I made a judgment call. No, I made a decision." Her voice wavered, betraying the fact that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. "Made a judgment?" Benson's voice rose slightly with incredulity. "That's it? Full stop? Are you accusing me of something?" She snapped back, her tone defensive. "I'm simply pointing out something that already happened," he replied evenly. "You made a decision about my daughter the second you saw her, even before you scanned her name, even before you did your job properly. His words cut through the air with a clarity that left little room for denial. Colleen crossed her arms again, almost as if it were an instinctive gesture of defiance. "I was protecting the integrity of the flight," she insisted. "We are trained to spot inconsistencies." Benson shook his head in quiet disbelief. "And what exactly was inconsistent here?" he asked. "A child standing in line with a valid ticket, quietly waiting his turn? There is nothing inconsistent about that." His tone was gentle yet firm, a tone that resonated with the authority of a man who had built his life on fairness and respect. The situation grew even more tense as Benson continued. "The security footage has already been flagged. Ryan made sure of that." He gestured toward the young attendant who had earlier tried to speak up. The supervisor, who had been standing just a few feet away, listened silently, absorbing every word. "You know what the worst part is?" Benson went on, his voice low but unwavering. "You didn't think twice about it until you realized who I was, and even then you weren't sorry. You were scrambling, desperate to cover up your mistake." His words caused Colleen's face to flush red once again as she glanced at the supervisor, perhaps hoping for someone to back her up. Benson's eyes softened with a mix of sorrow and resolve as he continued. "I have spent years building this airline, not because I needed to, but because I believed that travel could feel fair and inclusive. A place where everyone belonged in the sky, regardless of their name or background. And today, you reminded me just how far we still have to go." His words struck a chord in the quiet murmurs of those gathered around, a poignant reminder that fairness is not just an abstract concept, but a tangible expectation. Colleen's defiant gaze faltered as Benson's voice grew even more insistent. "You thought no one would notice," he said, his voice rising with an undercurrent of anguish. "That no one would care enough to speak up, and in many cases you might be right. Look around at these people. They've all resumed their travel routines pretending nothing happened." He gestured broadly to the crowd, some of whom continued to watch with concern, while others had returned to their phones and laptops, burying their eyes in indifference. "That is the true danger, Colleen. It is not just your silence that hurts. It is the silence of everyone who sees something wrong and chooses to ignore it." Her voice cracked slightly as the weight of his words sank in. Benson's tone softened, yet his words carried the full measure of his disappointment. "I did not mean to cause any trouble," he said, "but you made my daughter feel like a threat, a problem that needed handling, and no amount of customer service training can undo that damage." For a fleeting moment, it appeared as if Colleen might try to speak again. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, but then she fell silent. Perhaps that silence was the only honest response left. Stepping back to let the moment breathe, Benson gave her space, not to save face, but to force her to confront the consequences of her actions. Before long, Ryan reappeared, his expression somber as he announced, "Mr. Delancey, your daughter's new pass is ready." His voice was soft but steady as he continued, "It comes with a first-class upgrade at no charge." Benson's lips formed a brief, grateful smile as he replied, "Thank you, not for the upgrade, but for having the courage to speak up earlier. That took something." Ryan nodded quickly, and then returned to the desk without another word. A short while later, Evelyn rejoined her father, her eyes still wide from the shock of the earlier events, but now steadier with a hint of relief. "Dad, do I really have to sit up front?" she asked timidly. "I kinda like the wing seats better." Benson offered a small, reassuring smile as he replied, "We can trade seats if that makes you more comfortable." Their brief exchange carried the weight of a deeper understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that, even amid the chaos and cruelty, small moments of kindness could still shine through. The supervisor then cleared his throat once more and addressed Benson. "Mr. Delancey, I want to personally apologize. This is not what we stand for." Benson looked at him steadily and said, "I hope not, but I will be watching closely." The supervisor's eyes grew serious as he replied, "We will handle it from here." As they began walking toward the narrow jet bridge, what resonated most was not the exchange of words, but the profound silence that followed. The silence of those who had seen the injustice unfold and had chosen comfort over courage. The jet bridge, with its stale air and softly humming lights, became a passage not just to the airplane but into a space laden with unspoken consequences. Inside the plane, the flight crew had already been briefed on the incident. A woman in her late 40s, wearing a Navy uniform similar to Colleen's but with warmer, more inviting eyes and steady, gentle hands, greeted them immediately. "Mr. Delancey, we are so sorry about what happened at the gate," she said in a sincere tone. "Your seats are ready, and Evelyn, if you would like to visit the cockpit before takeoff, we would be delighted to show you around." Evelyn blinked in surprise, her eyes lighting up at the unexpected kindness. "Really?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The attendant smiled reassuringly and replied, "Really, the captain is quite a fan of your dad." Benson placed a comforting hand on Evelyn's back and said softly, "Go on, sweetheart, I'll be right here." As Evelyn followed the attendant toward the front of the plane, Benson watched her with a mixture of pride and a familiar ache. He had grown accustomed to seeing moments like these play out in the airline industry, but nothing ever ceased to sting when it affected his own family. Benson then settled into seat 2A and pulled out his phone. Rather than diving into a flood of corporate emails, he opened a notepad and typed a message to his chief of staff. "Gate agent at Sacramento Terminal C12. Incident involving unaccompanied minor. Security footage flagged. Request internal review and retraining evaluation. I'll handle the report. This one is personal." After sending the message, he leaned back and stared out of the window as the jet bridge slowly pulled away, leaving behind a lingering sense of unresolved tension in the terminal. Back on the ground, the aftermath was already unfolding in quiet corners. The supervisor, Dean Rosner, stood near the gate desk accompanied by Ryan, who, although now off duty, remained nearby with a thoughtful, almost regretful expression. Colleen continued to sit at her post, silent and unmoving, her eyes fixed on the screen as if she hoped it might somehow erase the memory of what she had done. Dean leaned in and, speaking quietly, said, "You understand what's coming, right?" Colleen did not even look up in response. "Disciplinary review at the very least," Dean continued, his tone carrying an undercurrent of finality. Colleen's jaw tightened as she whispered, "I didn't mean to," but Dean interjected firmly, "I know what you meant, but meaning something and doing it are two very different things. You acted without cause." He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, "That is documented. You singled out a child, did not follow proper protocol, and now there is a firestorm coming from the top. You have a file on you now, a very serious one." Colleen said nothing as the weight of his words settled over her like a heavy shroud. Meanwhile, Ryan stood with his arms crossed, his expression not one of smug satisfaction but of quiet disapproval. "You could have handled it differently," he said softly. "You had all the information you needed. The manifest was flagged, you just didn't care." Finally, Colleen's composure cracked, and she snapped back in a low, sharp voice. "Don't pretend like you've never missed something." Ryan's response was measured. "I have, but I have never shredded a child's ticket because he didn't look like someone I expected." At that moment, Dean cut in decisively, "All right, that's enough. HR will handle the rest of this matter." Ryan took a deep breath and walked off without so much as a goodbye, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with unresolved tension. Soon after, back on the plane, Evelyn returned from her tour of the cockpit with a small, shy smile playing on her lips. "Dad, they said I could press one of the buttons before we take off," she said excitedly. Benson raised an eyebrow and asked, "Did you ask what it did first?" "I'm not trying to launch the cargo door mid-air, you know." Evelyn grinned widely in reply, and for the first time that day, Benson laughed, a sound that resonated with genuine relief and warmth. Moments later, the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and the cabins settled as passengers buckled in. As the cabin lights dimmed and the soft murmur of settling passengers filled the space, Evelyn turned to her father with a hesitant question. "Are you mad at her?" Benson paused for a moment, the question lingering in the air, and then answered softly, "No." When she pressed, "Why not?" Benson's eyes shone with a mixture of wisdom and sorrow as he explained, "Because holding on to anger won't fix what happened. I want you to remember this day, not just for the pain, but for the fact that speaking up, standing up for what is right, can make a difference." His words were gentle and conversational, as if he were speaking to a dear friend, a message meant to comfort and guide someone who had already endured far too much. As the plane taxied down the jet bridge and began its slow journey toward the runway, the echoes of that incident at the gate continued to resonate in the minds of everyone involved. The memory of a young girl's hope being shattered by callous disregard, and a father's steadfast determination to see justice done, remained a powerful testament to the need for empathy and accountability. Over the course of the flight, as the airplane soared above vast American landscapes, from bustling cities to quiet, sprawling farmlands, the incident simmered quietly in Benson's thoughts. He recalled the day when he first built his airline, driven by the belief that travel was more than just a transaction. It was an experience meant to be cherished, respected, and accessible to all. In his vision, every traveler belonged in the sky, regardless of who they were, and that promise of inclusivity and fairness was the very foundation of his work. Benson's heart was heavy with disappointment, yet it also glowed with a quiet hope. That day at the gate had been a turning point, a stark reminder that even in a world governed by strict protocols and numbers, the human heart must never be overlooked. The image of Evelyn, standing alone with those torn fragments of paper in her small hands, was seared into his memory as a symbol of vulnerability and resilience. He vowed that such an injustice would not simply fade away into bureaucracy. It would be met with action. The message he had sent earlier on his phone was clear. Actions have consequences, and even one act of cruelty, however seemingly minor, must be addressed. As the flight continued and the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, the atmosphere took on a reflective quality. Passengers, once absorbed in their personal routines, now carried an unspoken awareness of the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. Though the memory of Colleen's unfeeling, harsh demeanor lingered, there was also the promise of change, a hope that the systems meant to protect could learn to balance efficiency with compassion. Benson, sitting quietly in his seat, mulled over the broader implications of that day. He wondered how many other children, how many other vulnerable souls might be overlooked in the rush of modern travel. The thought that a single moment, a single decision, could alter a child's sense of self-worth weighed heavily on him. During the quiet moments before takeoff, Benson leaned over and spoke softly to Evelyn, explaining that the kindness of a few brave souls had made a difference that day. He told her that while it was easy to be hurt by the actions of others, it was even more important to learn from those experiences and to stand up for what is right. His words were like a gentle lullaby, a mix of regret and hope that only someone who had seen both the best and the worst of humanity could offer. Evelyn listened intently, her eyes bright with a mix of lingering sadness and newfound understanding. As the flight attendants walked down the aisle checking on everyone, Benson's thoughts turned to the future. He resolved that this incident would not be an isolated moment of sorrow, but would instead spark meaningful change within his airline. His personal report would be the catalyst for a thorough internal review, a retraining of procedures to ensure that no other child would ever have to endure the humiliation that Evelyn had experienced. He envisioned a system where every passenger, especially the youngest and most vulnerable, would feel safe, respected, and truly valued. The journey through the skies became not just a physical transition from one destination to another, but also an emotional passage filled with lessons in fairness and accountability. Benson's inner dialogue, though quiet, was filled with resolve. Every mile the airplane covered over the sprawling American countryside was a reminder of the promise he had made to himself and to Evelyn, that the cruelty of unchecked authority would not define their lives. Instead, it would serve as a stepping stone toward a more compassionate tomorrow. As the cabin lights gradually brightened in anticipation of landing, the memories of that fateful day at the gate continued to echo in Benson's mind. The incident had become a quiet, enduring narrative, a reminder that even in the routine of travel, there could be moments of profound injustice, as well as moments of transformative courage. The image of Colleen, once so sure of her own importance, now seemed diminished against the backdrop of a father's unwavering love and a daughter's resilient spirit. In the final minutes before the airplane touched down, as the overhead bins clicked securely and the flight attendants offered warm smiles, Benson and Evelyn exchanged a look filled with silent understanding. It was a look that said, without any words, that while the day had been marred by pain and humiliation, it had also been a day of courage and hope. For Evelyn, the day would be remembered not only for the bitter sting of an unfair moment, but also for the powerful lesson that speaking up can indeed change the course of events. For Benson, it was a reminder that the true measure of a person is revealed not in calm times, but in the stormy moments, when one stands up for what is right. When the plane finally taxied to a stop and the passengers prepared to disembark into the warm embrace of an American city, the echoes of that day lingered as a silent testament to the importance of empathy, accountability, and the courage to stand up against injustice. The incident at the gate, with all its harsh words and painful silences, had woven itself into the fabric of their lives, a fabric that would forever remind them that no one, no matter how small, should ever be made to feel insignificant. As Benson and Evelyn stepped off the plane, they were met by the soft glow of a setting sun and the gentle murmur of a city ready to welcome them. The day's trials, though still fresh in their hearts, were slowly giving way to a legacy of hope and accountability. It was a legacy that would remind every traveler passing through that terminal that kindness and fairness are the true measures of our humanity. And for a young girl like Evelyn, whose spirit had been tested beyond her years, it was a beacon of hope, a promise that one day, her voice, however small, would be part of a larger movement for change. In the days that followed, the story of that day at the gate spread quietly among the staff and even reached the ears of some regular travelers. It became a tale of conflict and confrontation, of a single act of cruelty that sparked a chain reaction of accountability. People recalled how a determined father and his brave daughter had forced a system to reckon with its shortcomings. It was a story that stirred deep empathy and compassion, particularly among those who remembered the days when fairness and respect seemed like distant ideals rather than everyday truths. Benson's internal review led to sweeping changes within the airline. Colleen's file, now a serious mark against her record, became a case study in the failure of authority when it is not tempered by compassion. Training programs were overhauled, and the importance of empathy was emphasized as much as adherence to protocol. It was a long road to reform, but for Benson, every step forward was a victory against the cold indifference that had once nearly crushed his daughter's spirit. Over time, Evelyn began to understand the full measure of what had transpired. She came to see that the painful events at the gate were not just an isolated moment of humiliation, but a catalyst for a deeper change, a change that would help ensure that no other child would have to endure such treatment. She learned that the act of speaking up, though frightening and fraught with consequences, could spark a conversation about fairness and human dignity that reached far beyond the confines of an airport terminal. As months turned into years, the memory of that day continued to serve as a guiding light for both Benson and Evelyn. Benson would often recall the events with a mix of sorrow and pride, a sorrow for the injustice that had occurred and pride for the courage his daughter had shown in the face of it all. Evelyn, now a little older, would sometimes sit by the window on long flights and reminisce about the day when she learned that, Even when the world seems indifferent, one voice of compassion can ignite a movement for change. Their story, shared in quiet conversations over cups of coffee and long reflective walks, became a reminder to everyone who heard it that the human spirit is capable of great resilience. It was a story of conflict and confrontation, of cruelty met with the strength of love and accountability. And while the memory of Colleen's callous actions never entirely faded, it was eventually overshadowed by the profound impact that a father's determination and a daughter's quiet bravery had on an entire system. In the end, as they moved forward with their lives, Benson and Evelyn carried with them the lessons of that unforgettable day. They understood that while rules and procedures were necessary, they must always be balanced by compassion and a genuine desire to care for one another. Their journey that day had not been easy, but it had ignited a spark that would continue to burn brightly, lighting the way toward a future where every individual, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. This is the story of a day that began with cruelty and ended with hope. It is the story of Evelyn Carter, a brave young girl whose experience at the gate became a turning point not only for her, but for an entire airline determined to learn from its mistakes. It is the story of Benson Delancey, a father who refused to let injustice go unchallenged, and who used his voice to demand accountability in a system that too often valued procedure over people. And it is the story of how, even in the face of callous indifference, a few courageous souls can spark a change that echoes far beyond the confines of an airport terminal. As you reflect on this tale, remember that it is a reminder to all of us, no matter our age, that the strength of our compassion and the courage of our convictions can transform even the most painful moments into opportunities for growth and renewal. In every challenge we face, there is a chance to rise above the cruelty of the moment and to forge a path toward a more just and compassionate world. And though the scars of that day may remain, they also serve as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. A spirit that, when united by kindness and accountability, can turn even the darkest moments into a beacon of hope for the future. Logan Carter sat quietly in his seat as the gentle hum of the airplane filled the cabin, but his mind was far from at ease. His father, Benson Carter, had already explained to him that getting angry was easy, and that letting anger take over would only lead to more hurt. Getting mad is simple, Benson had said in a low, steady voice. Making sure it never happens again, that takes work. Logan had listened, nodding silently as his father's words sank in. It was a lesson he was still trying to understand on that long flight, a lesson about resilience in a world that sometimes seemed determined to make him feel like he did not belong. Logan remembered the way that dreadful gate agent had looked at him, an expression that screamed disdain and exclusion. Even now, as the plane lifted gracefully into the clear blue sky, the memory of that moment still stung. "She looked at me as if I didn't belong there," Logan murmured, his voice barely audible as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled note from his mother. The note, worn and creased from being clutched so tightly, simply said, "Still gonna look for the mountains." It was a small but constant reminder of hope, a reminder that even when someone tried to make him feel small, there was a world of wonder waiting just outside the window. Benson had glanced out the window, his eyes softening as he added, "You'll see them, and a lot more. Just don't ever let someone like her make you question if you deserve your seat on that plane." Even as the plane soared higher, leaving behind the chaos of the airport and the bitterness of that unjust encounter, Benson knew that the conversation between them was far from over. "The system that allowed this to happen isn't just at the gate," he said thoughtfully. "It's everywhere. And fixing it will take more than one flight." He spoke with a mix of sadness and determination, aware that the cruelty Logan had endured was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that needed to be broken. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, the sprawling city below shrank into patches of light and shadow, like a neatly packed suitcase tucked away in an overhead bin. Logan leaned toward the window, his forehead pressed against the cool plastic as he admired the view. "I think I see snow on the mountains," he said softly. Benson looked over his shoulder and squinted at the distant peaks. "Could be Mount Shasta," he suggested with a gentle smile. "Looks like it's covered in powdered sugar today." The two of them shared a quiet chuckle that broke through the lingering tension, a moment of fragile relief after the storm of the day's events. The flight, lasting just under 2 hours, offered them a brief respite as the skies remained smooth and calm. During the flight, passengers settled into their familiar mid-air routines. The soft rustling of newspapers, the quiet clicks of headphones, and the steady murmur of conversations created a soothing backdrop. At one point, a different flight attendant approached with 2 glasses of water and a folded note. Her name was Sharon, and she carried herself with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the earlier harshness at the gate. "This note was passed along from the gate supervisor before takeoff," she whispered as she handed Benson one of the glasses. "He said it's for you." Benson carefully unfolded the note, revealing a message from Dean Rosner, the supervisor who had witnessed the entire incident. The note read, "Mr. Carter, we are reviewing all recent gate interactions across terminals starting tomorrow. I know that a formal apology isn't enough, but we will do better. Sincerely, Dean Rosner." Benson folded the note slowly and slid it into his coat pocket as if it were a precious promise of change. Just then, an older man with a silver buzz cut and a worn denim jacket leaned over from across the aisle. "That your boy?" he asked in a gentle, inquisitive tone. Benson turned to him and nodded. "He is," he replied quietly, and he handled himself very calmly back there. The man's eyes crinkled with understanding as he said, "Most kids would have lost it. They are taught not to, but sometimes you need to be twice as patient." Benson paused before answering. "Twice as patient, yes, and 3 times as careful," he said, the weight of the day evident in his measured words. The older man nodded knowingly and then settled back in his seat, leaving the conversation hanging in the air, a reminder that wisdom often comes with the price of hard lessons. Not long after, Logan stretched his legs and let out a quiet yawn. "Will they fire her?" he asked suddenly, referring to the gate agent who had caused him so much pain. Benson looked at his son, his expression pensive. "Do you want them to?" he replied softly. "No," Logan whispered, his voice betraying both confusion and relief. "I want them to understand why it matters. It's not about punishment. It's about making sure they realize that erasing someone's dignity doesn't solve anything. People don't learn by just wiping the slate clean." Benson's eyes met his son's, and for a moment, the soft murmur of the airplane seemed to fade away, leaving them alone with their thoughts. "They learn when they are forced to see what they couldn't before," Benson continued, his tone filled with both regret and determination. Logan's gaze fell to his sketch pad, which he had finally opened for the first time since boarding. With a deep breath, he began to draw. A scene of towering mountains, wispy clouds, and a long, slender airplane cutting through the sky. It was bright with excitement as he said, "They let us build drones today. Mine flew straight into a tree." Benson chuckled softly over the phone, grateful for the distraction. "At least it took off," he replied. Logan continued, "I'll send you a picture when I get it out of the branches. How's everything else?" There was a brief pause, and then Logan added, "Good. But guess what? There's this other kid from Texas who asked me what I want to be when I grow up." Benson listened intently as his son's voice filled the phone, recalling the way things had unfolded at the gate that day. "I didn't feel like that at the airport," Logan continued, his voice softening with recollection. "I know," Benson replied with tenderness, "but one day, maybe someone will truly see you, not because of what I built, but because of who you are." There was a moment of silence before Logan spoke again, a quiet confession that carried with it the weight of a long and trying day. "I drew her, by the way," he said softly. "I drew the gate agent's face." Curious, Benson asked, "Who did you draw?" "I drew the woman from the gate," Logan explained. "Not in a mean way, just regular. I put her behind a desk and wrote on the glass window, 'Do better.'" Benson let those words hang in the air for a long moment, absorbing the quiet power of his son's simple act of defiance and hope. "That's a good drawing," he finally said. "Yeah, I think I'll keep it," Logan replied, his voice filled with a newfound determination to remember and learn from every moment. They exchanged their good nights, and the call ended, leaving Benson alone in his dark office for a few more moments. He sat there, reflecting on the day's events. What had happened at that gate was not rare. It was a pattern that many people failed to understand. It was not a shock when a child was treated as if he did not belong. It was the everyday result of a system that allowed such cruelty to flourish, yet Benson believed that patterns could be broken, not by shouting or making a scene, but by taking deliberate, thoughtful action, by naming injustice when it was easier to let it slide. It was about raising a son who knew how to stay composed when the ground shifted beneath him, and standing up so that silence would no longer be an option. Not at airports, not at schools, not anywhere. Benson's thoughts turned to all those who might be watching his story unfold, those who might see a bit of themselves in Logan's quiet strength. If you've ever witnessed something like this, if you've ever felt like you were just too quiet when you should have spoken up, know that you are not alone, he thought. Silence does not protect anyone. It permits injustice to continue. And when people finally speak up, truly speak up, systems begin to shift. If this story has moved you even a little, share it. Not for the sake of attention, but for awareness, for accountability, and for every kid who just wants to sit in their seat without being made to feel like a problem. Benson recalled the final message that had been broadcast in the terminal, a message that he hoped would resonate far beyond that one painful day. Subscribe if you believe that respect should never depend on recognition. And next time you see something that doesn't feel right, do not look away. Say something. Those words were more than a call to action. They were a promise that every act of kindness and every stand for accountability could change the world, one flight at a time. In the quiet aftermath of that fateful day, as Benson prepared for his meeting with the legal team and awaited a meeting with Colleen Drezna, a meeting he had firmly set for next week, he couldn't help but reflect on the heavy cost of silence. The torn boarding pass in his pocket was a constant reminder of that cost. It was paper, fragile and easily torn, yet it was heavy with meaning. It represented a moment when a young boy, Logan Carter, had been treated with disdain and cruelty simply for being who he was. And it represented the beginning of a movement, a personal revolution in which one father's determination and one child's resilience would ripple through the halls of an airline, forcing changes that would make travel a kinder, fairer place for all. As Benson sat in his quiet office that evening, the glow of the city lights outside seemed to mirror the flicker of hope within him. The email from Dean Rosner had confirmed that changes were coming. A new training initiative focused on bias recognition, de-escalation, and youth engagement. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there was no immediate satisfaction in knowing that the gate agent had been placed on leave, but it was a start. A small step toward making sure that no other child would ever have to endure the humiliation that Logan had suffered. Benson's mind wandered back to the conversation on the plane, the gentle yet powerful words he had shared with his son. The right thing doesn't stop being right just because it's inconvenient, he had told Logan. That thought echoed in his mind as he reviewed the day's events. He knew that change would not happen overnight. The systems that allowed such cruelty were deeply ingrained, and it would take more than one flight, more than one angry email to dismantle them, but it would take action. It would take each of us speaking up when it matters most. In the days and weeks that followed, Benson would continue to push for accountability and reform. He made sure that the story of that day, of Logan's quiet courage in the face of unyielding cruelty, was not forgotten. He shared it with colleagues, with friends, and with anyone who would listen. It became a quiet call for change, a plea that even in the most routine moments, compassion and fairness must prevail. Benson's own journey was far from over, but he took comfort in knowing that by raising Logan to be patient, thoughtful, and strong, he was contributing to a future where every traveler, young or old, would be treated with the dignity they deserved. That night, as Benson finally left his office and headed home, he carried with him the weight of the day, but also the light of hope. He thought about Logan's drawing, the simple image of a woman behind a desk with the words, "Do better," scrawled on a glass window. It was a small act of artistic rebellion, a reminder that change often begins with a single, unassuming gesture. Benson promised himself that he would keep fighting, that he would never allow the silence of bystanders to become the norm, because he knew, deep down, that when people speak up, when they share their stories and demand respect, the world can begin to shift. As he walked through the quiet streets of Oakland that night, Benson felt a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of that day at the gate was a scar he would carry with him forever, but it was also a badge of honor, a testament to the fact that even in the midst of cruelty, the human spirit could prevail. And in that moment, he vowed that no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, he would continue to stand up for what was right. He would make sure that every child who boarded a plane, every person who dared to dream of flying high, would never again be made to feel like they didn't belong. In the end, the lesson was clear. Silence does not protect anyone. It only permits injustice to take root. But when we speak out, when we refuse to let cruelty pass unchecked, we have the power to create change. And as Benson Carter prepared for the challenges ahead, preparing for a meeting with Colleen Drezna, preparing for further battles in a system that often favored indifference over empathy, he did so with the unwavering belief that respect and accountability were not just lofty ideals, but necessities in a world that too often lets small voices be drowned out. If you, dear listener, have ever felt that you were too quiet when you should have spoken up, know that you are not alone. Each of us has experienced moments when injustice seemed overwhelming, when the systems around us failed to protect what was most precious. But remember, it is in those moments of silence that the seeds of change are sown. When we finally find the courage to speak, when we finally demand that others do better, we begin to break the cycle of cruelty and indifference. So, if this story has touched your heart even a little, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not for the sake of attention, but for the sake of awareness, for accountability, and for every child who is just trying to get to their seat without being made to feel like a burden. Let this be a reminder that respect should never depend on recognition, and that every time we see something that doesn't sit right, we must not look away. We must say something. In the quiet hours after that long flight, as the city of Seattle welcomed them with open arms and the promise of new beginnings, Benson and Logan Carter embarked on a journey that was as much about healing as it was about moving forward. For Benson, the events of that day had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to truly serve others, not just as a businessman, but as a compassionate human being. And for Logan, the memory of that painful moment would serve as a beacon, guiding him through the challenges of life with a quiet strength and an unwavering belief that he belonged. Now, as you listen to this story, let it remind you that every act of cruelty can be met with an act of courage. Every moment of injustice can be transformed by a call for accountability, and every time we choose to speak up, we make the world a little bit better. Because in the end, it is not the silence of the powerful that shapes our lives, but the voices of those who dare to demand that everyone be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Remember, dear friend, that the power to change the world lies within each of us, and while the skies may sometimes be filled with clouds of indifference, there is always a ray of hope shining through, a hope that reminds us that together, through our words and our actions, we can build a future where every person is seen, heard, and valued. This is the story of Logan Carter and his father, Benson Carter. a story of conflict, of cruelty, and of the redemptive power of speaking out. It is a story meant to inspire, to bring comfort to those who have felt small and alone, and to remind us that no matter how many times we are pushed down, we have the strength to rise again. And if you believe, as I do, that respect and accountability should be the cornerstones of our everyday lives, then let this story be a beacon of hope, a call to action that resonates far beyond the confines of an airplane cabin. So the next time you witness an injustice, whether it happens in an airport, at a school, or anywhere in this vast, complex world, remember the tale of Logan and Benson Carter. Remember that silence only permits wrongdoing, and that every voice raised in defense of what is right has the power to shift systems and change lives. And above all, remember that even in the face of harsh cruelty, the human spirit can, and always will, triumph. As you reflect on this story, take a moment to honor those who have had to fight for their dignity, to speak out when it was easier to remain silent, and to stand up for others even when it was not the popular thing to do. For it is in these small, courageous acts that true change is born. A change that, over time, can transform not just an airline or a school, but an entire society. Thank you for listening to this tale. May it inspire you to never let silence be your refuge, but rather to let your voice be the instrument of change that this world so desperately needs.